Josh Kothrick, who is our investigator in charge, and he'll be able to answer any questions that I may not be able to. And we're here, obviously, to investigate the Guardian Medevac flight that crashed Friday evening, February 24th, this last Friday. First off, I want to offer, on behalf of the entire NTSB, our condolences to the family and of the flight crew and the patients on board. And it was a real tragedy, and our thoughts go out to them. I'd also like to thank the first responders who helped us with this, including the Lyon County Sheriff and the Lyon County Central Fire District. So we're here to give a preliminary assessment, and the details of what we provide to you here may change. This is what we know at this point. The crash occurred at about 9:14 Pacific Standard Time near Dayton, Nevada. 5 people on board: a pilot, a flight nurse, a patient, a paramedic, and a family member. Tragically, there were no survivors. The flight was operated by Guardian Flight based in South Jordan, Utah, which I understand is close to Salt Lake City, under Federal Air Regulation Part 135, which means that they are operating for hire. They have a fleet of over 60 aircraft that they operate in various locations around the country. This will be the 4th event that the NTSB has investigated with Guardian Flight. Over the last several years, they had a fatal accident here that is still an investigation, a King Air that was lost in Hawaii, 3 fatalities. That is still in process. Another King Air in Alaska, also 3 fatalities. The cause of that is undetermined. And a incident in Arizona involving a loss of control. There were no injuries and no fatalities and no damage to the aircraft. The aircraft itself was a Pilatus PC-12. It's a single-engine fixed-wing turboprop. They departed Reno at approximately 9 o'clock, headed for Salt Lake City on an instrument flight rules flight plan. They were airborne for about 14 minutes. Normal air traffic control communications, they were cleared to flight level 250 or 25,000 feet. The highest the flight attained was just over 19,000 feet when radar noticed that the aircraft was in a descending right turn at a high rate of descent. The last radar return was at about 11,000 feet, and the evidence we have at this point is that the aircraft broke up in flight. The outboard section of the right wing, the the horizontal stabilizer and elevator also departed the aircraft. We have recovered those pieces. They were about a half to 3/4 of a mile from the runway. The aircraft, the flight wreckage. The aircraft did not have any flight data recorders on it or cockpit voice recorders, nor was it required to. This is something that the NTSB would like to see the FAA require on these airplanes. We have an investigative team of approximately 11 people now that are here from literally all over the country. They will be here for several days and gathering perishable evidence. We have a team out there on the field right now that is combing the area for parts of the aircraft. We'll be looking at the engines, any recording devices outside of the approved recorders that it did not have on board. The avionics equipment on the aircraft sometimes will have data on board that we can download information from. We'll be looking at the pilot, the aircraft itself, whatever maintenance records there were, the fuel on the aircraft, the weather conditions. Icing was reported and moderate turbulence in the area, so that will be an area of interest for us. The company's dispatch procedures and their general policies. The team members we have here are structures, avionics, systems, operations, meteorology, human factors. Our transportation disaster assistance people are here also to help with the families, and air traffic control people. Preliminary report should be out in about 2 weeks. And at that point, we'll be able to add a little bit more to what we know. We won't have a probable cause, though, and final report until probably 12 to 18 months after the crash, as long as it takes for us to get to the bottom of this. For media updates, that would be Twitter at NTSB_newsroom. And if there are any witness out there that have any information for us, witness at ntsb.gov. So that's what we know at this point. Obviously, there's a lot more to learn. So I will take your questions. If you would, please raise your hand. And when I call on you, state your name and your affiliation. Yes, sir.
Bert Johnson with KUNR Public Radio. I'm curious, first of all, do you know at this point where the flight was departing from, which airfield it left from?
Yes. Where was the flight departing from? It departed from Reno International Airport, and it was bound for Salt Lake City. It was on an instrument flight rule flight plan. The radar track and all of the radio communications with air traffic control were absolutely normal. There was no distress call at any point from the aircraft saying they had any kind of difficulty whatsoever.
Is the weather the main factor, do you think?
That's one of the, is the weather the main factor? That's one of the things we'll be looking at. I think it's too soon at this point to rule anything in or anything out. There are any number of possibilities on this, but weather will get a very close scrutiny. I can assure you. They reported moderate turbulence and icing conditions. These airplanes are designed to fly in that type of weather condition, but obviously there could be something, and we'll be looking at both the big picture. We'll be getting pilot reports from air traffic control, anything that anybody had on the air traffic system that will provide that. Yes, ma'am.
My name's Amy. I'm from the Reno Gazette-Journal. Did I hear you correctly that you said the pieces broke up in the air?
That is correct. The
and
question.
What would cause something like that from your past knowledge?
Okay, so the question was, did the aircraft break up in the air, and what would cause that? So, yes, the aircraft did break up prior to ground contact. We don't know exactly what altitude at which that occurred. That's one of the things that we'll be looking at. There are any number of possibilities as to why an aircraft could break up, and it'll be something that we'll be looking at. Overstress is one of the things. The aircraft could encounter turbulence. We don't know that yet. Fatigue, possibly, on the part of the aircraft. Again, this is a little bit unusual. Airplanes are well built and well maintained. Corrosion, stress factors, all of those things. You bring up a good point, however. Once we have gathered all of the perishable evidence that's here, the wreckage will be moved to a secured facility in Phoenix, where our people will go through it in great detail. And they will be looking very closely at the wreckage signature and the parts of the aircraft. And when they find the right parts and pieces, those will probably be shipped to our metallurgical laboratory at NTSB headquarters in Washington, D.C., and they have an electron scanning microscope, and they will go through this thing absolutely to determine exactly what happened, and we'll have a pretty good idea then of why, but right now we just don't know. Yes, sir.
Jason, also from the Reno Gazette-Journal. How are you already able to determine that the plane was breaking up before it hit the ground or crashed? If there's an easy way to explain that.
Good question of how do we know that the aircraft broke up in flight? Very simply, if the airplane is intact at the main wreckage location, then you know that it was all together when it came there. This was not the case here. As I said, we found parts of the aircraft about half to 3/4 of a mile away, and we've had a team out there pretty much all day combing the area to make sure that we get all of the pieces, because that will help us to understand exactly what transpired. Yes, ma'am.
Kelsey with Carson now. So you said that this is the fourth such instance of these crafts going down. Has there been a determined cause for the prior three of why they went down?
Okay, so
Or had issues?
the question is, this is the fourth incident involving Guardian flight. To my knowledge, we do not have much detail on the prior ones. The one in Hawaii, which I just mentioned, that aircraft went into the ocean. They did recover it. That is still in process. The aircraft in Canada, that unfortunately remains undetermined. We were unable to determine why that aircraft crashed. The incident that involved a loss of control involved a autopilot malfunction, I believe, and a pilot overreaction. So those are all on our website, and you could take a look. So.
And I'm sorry, one follow-up question. So does NTSB look into maintenance logs of Guardian flight for these crashes to see that the crafts were being maintained properly?
The question is, does NTSB look into the maintenance logs on any event that we investigate? And the answer is absolutely yes. We look at all of those things because we need to determine, was there something in the maintenance that caused the aircraft to malfunction and then the pilot was unable to cope with it. We'll also be looking at the pilot's training records and all of those things. So we go through every possible conceivable way that this could occur. So that helps us to understand what happened, the why it happened, and then if there's something that we can learn from this to help us make recommendations to the FAA, to the operators, and others to prevent it from happening again. Sorry.
Was this medical transport an emergency? Why was this flight scheduled for when it was?
The question was this medical transport an emergency? I don't have any information on that, so I really can't answer it. Normally, there are less expensive ways to get people around the country than to do that, so I suspect that there was probably some pretty important reason to have a medical transport, but we don't know for certain at this point.
And a quick follow-up, if I may. I also saw an announcement, I think, from CareFlight that said all their flights had been suspended. Is that true?
I believe the question is, has CareFlight gone into a safety stand down? And I believe that is, in fact, the case. Josh, do you have any information on that?
I've not heard yet.
Okay. We think that's the case. We're not certain. But I did fail to mention parties to the investigation. So these are people who have technical knowledge to help us in working the investigation. So obviously, the airframe manufacturer Pilatus, which is Swiss, they are technically not a party. They are an accredited representative. FAA will be a party to the investigation. Air traffic control will also be a party. And Honeywell, who made the avionics on board the aircraft, will be a party to the investigation. Yes, ma'am.
Two questions. Can you please tell me who makes the final call when to go up in bad weather? And for those of us who aren't well versed in aeronautics, can you please rename the pieces of the plane that broke up? I didn't catch all of them.
Okay, so the question is, who makes the final call as to when an aircraft is dispatched and then the parts and pieces of the aircraft? Okay, so it depends on the operator, but typically that's going to be a decision by the operator's dispatcher. Josh, help me if I misspeak here, but that's typically going to be the dispatcher and the pilot. They will have a discussion between them as to the aircraft's capability and whether it is in fact going to be safe to go. And they also have what they're called operating specifications, so that they have made an agreement with the FAA that we will only fly under these types of conditions. And so that would be between the operator, the dispatcher, and the pilot.
Who was the operator on this one?
This was Guardian flight. So the second question of the parts of the aircraft, what we know at this point, subject to change, is the outboard section of the right wing, the horizontal stabilizer, which is on the tail of the aircraft, and the elevator, which is the control surface, which is attached to the horizontal stabilizer. And obviously when those pieces separate, they generally pull some other things along with them. The big pieces, our team is relatively easy to find. The small pieces, which often will be important, such as actuators and things of that nature, which will help tell the story, that takes a little more because they may not be much bigger than the span of your hand, but they'll be important. So that's why we've had a team out there all day looking through the field to make sure that they have everything. And then all of that will go back to the secure facility where they will look through everything and make detailed assessment.
How long do you think you guys are going to be here recovering the site?
So the question is, how long are we going to be here on site? Josh, any thoughts on that?
As of right now, we're planning on being here the next several days, most likely through, at the very latest, next Saturday. Just depends on what the weather brings to us right now.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. I mean, there seems to be an impending storm. You know, is that going to play, is that going to really harm your chances of finding everything you're going to find?
So the question is, does the weather impact the investigation? It does, but we've taken really good advantage of today. The weather was good today, and if we need some additional resources, we'll ask for them to make sure that we get everything. Obviously, it's harder when you don't have all of the wreckage in one place, but I think we'll not have too much difficulty in accomplishing that.
Is it difficult to put pieces together at your warehouse when you guys take it back there to determine what happened?
I will defer to Josh on that. The question is it difficult to reassemble in order to tell the story?
I wouldn't say it's difficult per se. It's a challenge. I mean, you usually have multiple pieces, multiple components, and it's extremely time consuming. To make sure we do the most thorough exam we can do during the wreckage exam process. So it is a very timely exam.
This is, not to make light of this, but it's a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle to do this, and obviously the pieces are not in the same condition as when the aircraft was put together, so you have to figure that out. Yes, ma'am.
Crystal with Cole. I was just wondering, I know you already talked about, obviously this is not a normal thing for a plane to fall apart while it's in flight. Do we know anything about like how old this plane is? How often do these aircrafts get checked to make sure they're up to standard?
So the question was, how often do these aircraft get inspected? And generally speaking, under Part 135, I believe they are required to have every 100 flight hours. They must have an inspection, and then they also have annual inspections. So they're pretty thoroughly reviewed on a regular basis. And this airplane, I believe, was manufactured in 2002. So it's relatively new, relatively. So.
Abby with Channel 4. Is there a federal threshold for taking off and flying in different weather conditions?
So the question is there a federal threshold for weather conditions? When you operate under Part 121, which is the airlines, or Part 135, they have what they call operational specifications, and that's an agreement between the operator and the FAA as to under what conditions you will be able to fly for takeoff, for continuing flight. Obviously, it's going to be based on what the aircraft is capable of. The pilots all have to meet a certain qualification. So I don't believe there was anything in the weather that evening that would have precluded them from flying. As I said, it was pretty much a normal evening around Reno. A winter evening, you've got turbulence, you've got wind. That's situation normal for here. So, but we're going to look at all of that.
And just to make sure I have the full picture, the pieces that separated from the aircraft to what was in midair, were those all from the right side of the aircraft?
The right wing exterior panel. So the question was, were the parts and pieces that came off the airplane, where did they come from? The right side wing, part of the wing, not the entire wing, but part of the right wing separated. The other part was the tail section, which is the horizontal stabilizer, which sits on top of the vertical stabilizer, and then there's a movable flight control that is attached to that, and that whole portion separated from the aircraft.
And one last question.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Kind of shifts a little bit to the people. Who is responsible for the recovery of the victims? I'm Terry Demetriou, chaplain with Carson Hospital.
So the question is, who's responsible for the recovery of the victims? That would be left to the first responders. So that would be the sheriff's department and the fire department, and so they handle all of that typically right after the crash and then before our people come on scene. So thank you very much for being here. We would rather see all of you under more pleasant circumstances, so we appreciate it, and rest assured that we will be working on this for some time to make sure that we understand exactly why this crash happened and if there's any way to prevent future accidents of this type. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for holding those. I'm looking for those awesome.
Yeah, oh my God,
Thank
my
you
arm's
for
killing me.
The human mic stand.
My arms, man. Thanks for not yelling at me, like my photographer.